Commercial vessels under attack. The blockades by the US and Iran in the Strait of Hormuz are disrupting global trade. The crisis highlights the danger conflicts and territorial disputes pose to shipping. Why are maritime laws failing to secure the seas? This is Inside Story. Hello again, I'm James Bays. Wars and territorial disputes are rewriting the rules of global shipping. From the Strait of Hormuz to the Panama Canal, from the Red Sea to the Black Sea, maritime traffic is under increasing threat. The UN says global trade growth is expected to slow from about 4.7% in 2025 to less than 2.5% this year. There's also the danger posed by pirates. Last year, the number of piracy incidents rose to its highest in 5 years, according to the International Maritime Bureau. So, is shipping becoming the new global battleground? Why are the decades-old laws governing the sea failing? We'll discuss all of this with our guests when they join us in a moment. But first, this report by Ferdia Carr.
The waters of the Strait of Hormuz may appear calm, but they are a front line in the war between the US and Iran.
There is no any permission for you used from Hormuz Strait. You are ordered to go back to your departure immediately.
Iran's restrictions on shipping and the US blockade of Iranian ports have effectively closed the crucial maritime trade route. It's one of several waterways where freedom of navigation is at risk. Though the principle is older, freedom of navigation became international law in 1982 with the UN Convention on the Laws of the Sea. It states that ships can't be impeded in international and territorial waters as long as their passage is peaceful. Those rules have maintained a system of free-flowing global trade which has grown from about $60 billion in the 1950s to more than $25 trillion last year, according to the World Trade Organization. The UN has warned that prosperity is under threat.
Navigational rights and freedoms must be restored immediately. Open the strait, let all ships pass, let the global economy breathe again.
Though not a signatory, the US has long seen itself as a guarantor of that principle. It's led anti-piracy patrols in the Indian Ocean since 2009 and carried out strikes against Houthis in the Red Sea in 2024 and 2025 when the Yemeni armed group attacked ships it said were linked to Israel in response to Israel's war on Gaza. More recently, the Revolutionary Guard warned it could close the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, a choke point leading to the Suez Canal, after President Donald Trump said American forces would destroy Iranian power plants. The US is also accused of violating freedom of navigation by imposing a blockade on ships entering or leaving Iranian ports, as is Tehran for its attacks on vessels in the Strait of Hormuz, and for drafting a law which would see it charge toll fees for safe passage. Since 2022, both Russia and Ukraine have bombed each other's vessels in the Black Sea. And it's not just international waterways. Tensions between the US and China over the Panama Canal have escalated during Trump's second term. Washington accused Beijing of violating Panama's sovereignty by detaining 2 of its vessels, while China accuses the US of hypocrisy, citing Trump's comments about taking back the canal.
Who is coveting the Panama Canal, attempting to turn what should be a permanently neutral international waterway into its own private channel, while disregarding the sovereignty of countries in the region? The answer is self-evident.
With maritime laws undermined, there are fears that the ease of trade on which the global economy depends could also be threatened. Ferdia Carr, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
So, a complex subject, but we have the right guests to make sense of it on today's Inside Story. Joining us from Medford in Massachusetts, Rockford Weitz. He is director of the Fletcher Maritime Studies Program at Tufts University. George Theodoridis is in Malmö in Sweden. He's a professor of maritime law and policy at the World Maritime University. And in Kavala in Greece is Stavros Karamperidis, an associate professor in maritime economics at Plymouth University. So we have an expert in the law, an expert in the economy, and an expert in the security situation. Let's start with you then, Rockford. Security is your area. How bad is the state of maritime security?
Well, it's definitely not good. 2026 has not been a good year for maritime security. As we've seen, it's truly a global phenomenon from what we saw in Venezuela and the Caribbean. We've had issues in the Red Sea with the Houthis and now in the Strait of Hormuz and continued tensions in the South China Sea and Taiwan Strait. So I would say it's under tremendous pressure.
Stavros, I mean, let's just start with the story that is dominating and has been dominating the news across the world now for a couple of months, which is the war in Iran. And what is interesting about this is that a conflict that started with the nuclear issue and the fear of nuclear war, it seems now a waterway is a more potent weapon than a nuclear warhead.
Thank you very much for having me, James. And to be frank, yes, I think that's the $1 billion question that you're just asking, which it seems that we underestimated in the global sphere the importance of shipping. And shipping, as we constantly say, is the backbone of the global economy. And anyone who is able to control that is able to kind of control where the global economy goes. So I think what we're seeing in the Strait of Hormuz at the moment is exactly what you described. It's like people are trying to project their power according to where they want the economy to go. And I wouldn't equivalent it to a nuclear warhead, but definitely can make a huge damage. And we see some damage happening already in the global economy because of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. So I think we should look at it cautious and see how the things will evolve.
George, there are supposed to be laws. We'll come into more detail of what those laws are. But Iran is or has been running the Strait of Hormuz as though it's a toll booth. That's against international law. And it's not just Iran. Now, the US with its own blockade. And of course, it was the US that started, along with Israel, this war. Many say in breach of the UN Charter.
Well, first, let me start by thanking you for having me here. It's a very complicated issue, and I'll try to keep it as simple as possible. Indeed, we have rules. We have primarily the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea, which was shown earlier, which to a certain extent has codified previous customary rules. Now, interestingly, both belligerent states, albeit in ceasefire at the moment, they have not ratified the convention. They've only signed the convention. Therefore, they're not bound in the strict sense. However, they're bound by international and international customary law. So the question is whether those acts really are infringing the system that we have. Well, I'm going to say that at the moment, the global system of maritime governance that we have is under a huge pressure. Now, if you make legislation which is very detailed, the states are very suffocated. They feel suffocated. They will not ratify it. If you get too much freedom and you ask really for the states to act responsibly, then you have what you call the gray areas where the agitators, the perpetrators, can commit certain acts. At the moment, we have an unprecedented, really double blockade. And of course, the most significant repercussion at the moment, apart, of course, from the legal dimension, is the fact that navigation, freedom of navigation, which is a sacrosanct rule, has been really at the moment under tremendous pressure. So just to keep it simple, I think at the moment the rules are being under a lot of pressure.
So the law isn't working, the economy of it's not working, and the security situation is not working. Let's, I think, go back and explain what's at stake with all of this and how global shipping works. And I mean, I was doing the research on this. You'll all know this, but I didn't. There's a very important date, a date that some say changed the world. And it's not one that was in my mind. The 26th of April, 19 1956. That's when a man called Malcolm McLean, a trucking entrepreneur from North Carolina, loaded truck bodies, aluminium truck bodies, on a World War II tanker. Took 5 days for them to go from Newark in New Jersey to Houston, Texas. And that was the first container ship in essence. Perhaps you can tell us, Stavros, about containerization and how it completely revolutionized the world.
Yes, and the name of the vessel was the Ideal X, which is, the mother vessel of everything else that was built on it. You're absolutely right. Since the birth of containerization, transportation became cheaper. Thanks to Malcolm McLean, we managed to see how we can reduce inefficiencies. And since then, the overall logistics operations, they're always trying to reduce inefficiency in the system. So that's why we managed to have a very efficient system because of shipping. That's why shipping is carrying approximately 85% of the global trade in terms of volume, because it's cheap, reliable, and resilient. And the thing is that, I can give you some very bold figures. Everybody's talking about, for example, the cost of oil and all that kind of stuff. Before the crisis, transferring with a VLCC a barrel of oil was $0.03 US. We're talking about a fraction of it. Now, because of what is happening, because of the increased insurance cost, because of all the other issues, the increased freight rates that we are hearing left, right, and center, that has increased tenfold. And of course, now we're talking about a $0.3 US per day, which, if you consider that every vessel takes a lot of time to go from point A to point B, that adds a lot to the overall transportation cost. So thankfully, as we said, we managed with shipping to be able to fuel globalization because it was very cheap and reliable. Unfortunately, with what George was mentioning a minute ago, that is under question.
Stavros, what I find interesting is that this is a sort of invisible infrastructure. None of us think about it, how we get stuff, how the food arrives, how the fuel arrives. But this goes on and has gone on for decades, this global supply chain by ships. And it affects everyone, not just the rich people in society. If you're living in a tent, some of the aid deliveries and food will be coming by shipping.
That's totally correct, James. And, we have approximately 100,000 vessels operating around the globe. We heard in the news several times that there are 20,000 sailors have been trapped in the Strait of Hormuz because of the overall situation. There are thousands and millions of people operating into the maritime sector. And we're very pleased to say that, we were doing that for many, many years without attracting any of attention, because we're very reliable and very cost effective on what shipping is doing and is able to do. But as you rightly said, what is happening now, it has a knock-on effect to everybody, because, the simplest thing you have to consider, when the oil price goes up, that means that the bunkers, the fuel cost that the vessels are paying is increasing. I can give you an example. Before the war, it was approximately $480 US per ton. Now we're talking about nearly 900. So, nearly double up the amount of fuel cost that is required for move the vessels. So as you can imagine, all those costs have been accumulated in the overall operations of the vessel. And of course, that will pass to the final customer, because someone will have to pay for that.
Rockford, there's also what's called the just-in-time economy, making things, including fresh produce, arrive just when it is needed. All of this, though, has created a fragility, has it not, which is now being exploited. We saw it in COVID-19, but now it's being exploited by bad actors.
This is correct. Yeah. And thank you also for having me. It's great to be here. So you're absolutely right about that what we saw, really COVID-19 was the first peacetime global disruption of trade. And we saw all kinds of vulnerabilities. It's kind of hard to imagine that was 6 years ago. And there have been efforts to try to increase resilience in the system and do some what's called reshoring locally for larger countries like the United States, or regionally in Europe or North America, for example. But as we have witnessed over the last 2 months, just one critical maritime choke point being blocked for an extended period has all kinds of second and third order effects. And so we're seeing it not just with hydrocarbons, with liquefied natural gas, crude oil, but also fertilizer, helium, food coming in. Aid is actually avoiding even the Red Sea, so it's going from India all the way around Africa through Strait of Gibraltar and Suez Canal to get to Port Sudan for Sudan. This really is, I would say it's not unprecedented in history, but it is unprecedented since the end of World War II. So during the sort of peaceful rise of globalization, and certainly since the age of containerization was launched by Malcolm McLean in the 50s. So in that case, the whole system is under pressure, and we're seeing it regionally and globally.
So, George, I mean, mentioned there from Rockford of these problem areas, choke points, bottlenecks in the system. And my understanding is they don't all have the same legal basis. The Suez Canal is not the same as the Strait of Hormuz, for example.
That is absolutely right. Indeed, the law of the sea has made a very clear distinction of the different areas and, of course, the different rules that apply. Let me just say at this point that the legislator, I'm talking about the UNCLOS, has very
Sorry,
aptly,
I'm going to interrupt you there. UNCLOS, just tell me what that is, to be absolutely clear what that... UN love their acronyms. Tell me what UNCLOS is.
Sorry, I mentioned it earlier. It was actually shown on the video, United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea.
Yeah.
Which is what we call the Constitution of the Oceans, because of the large number of ratifications that it has. So the legislator has very clearly made differences and different legal treatment about the different waters. So in the case of a strait, there are certain rights which can be exercised, apart, of course, from the right of navigation. We also have the right of transit passage. And again, the legislation, it's very clear, no duties, no charges are supposed to be imposed unless there is a service. So in the case of Panama Canal or Suez Canal, where you have installations, infrastructure, and therefore expenses, and some service is being paid, then in that case, that is perfectly justified. But in the case of straits, this is really not a gray area, but something that I would venture to say will bring us back to the Dark Ages, where we were trying to convince as an international legal community that we should have freedom of navigations. Back at that time in the 17th century, there were assertions by the big nations at that time, maritime nations like Spain and Portugal, that there should be exclusive sovereign rights in the seas. And that, of course, was linked at that time again with the trade lanes. So we moved from that. Yet with these kinds of actions, I see that we're trying in a way to bring back from a back door something which we would expect that it's out of any discussion.
Let's bring in Stavros and talk about piracy. And people think of the image of a pirate with the tricorn hat and the cutlass and the Jolly Roger flag. Tell us about piracy in the modern world.
In the modern world, pirates are very sophisticated. They have specialized sections, how they operate, and we've done recently a work on that, on what is happening off the Gulf of Guinea and how the pirates are operating over there. But what we're seeing now at the moment is that, unfortunately, because of a lot of naval forces being in the area of the Gulf, in the Persian Gulf, there is a lot of activity in other places that was forgotten about. So a lot of pirates, because of previously there used to be a lot of naval operations taking place in other parts of the globe, and now they've been repositioned either back in Europe for protecting the European continent or coming into Mediterranean or in the Middle East. That's why they found opportunity gaps, let's call them that way, that they were able to go out and do what they used to do for a couple of years ago. And unfortunately, that's not a good scenario because, as you know, there's not a limited amount of naval power out there. And of course, I'm sure Rockford will tell us a bit more on that. But because we have limited amount of naval forces at the moment, we could probably imagine what will happen if those naval forces are being deployed in specific areas, that piracy will start merging up again in areas that we've seen that has kind of clearly or closely to elimination. They were close to elimination of those areas.
Well, let me ask you, Rockford, about those naval forces. And I think it's interesting. You don't have to go back that far. 2009, the UN Security Council was unanimous on this issue. It was about Somali pirates at the time. They formed something called Combined Task Force 151, and it was supported by all the 5 permanent members of the Security Council deploying naval forces on the same side. We're in a different world now, aren't we?
Yes, we are. I cover this in both my maritime geopolitics class and my law of the sea class because it is important to distinguish piracy from non-state armed groups like the Houthis that are really engaged in kind of asymmetric warfare. So let me try to unpack it. So what really has what you were referring to back in 2009 was the assembly of the greatest, most powerful maritime coalition in history. It included NATO, it included Japan and China, it included even Iran contributed to it, as well as India and Pakistan. So you can imagine essentially everyone could unify, and the international law against piracy is quite clear and not controversial, but everyone could unify against the Somali pirates. And there were no permanent members of the UN Security Council that would get in the way of a UN Security Council resolution. So it was much easier to assemble a maritime coalition back on that maritime challenge. What we're seeing unfold today is different because Russia in particular is willing to get in the way of a UN Security Council resolution. Bahrain has tried to do that, but Russia actually likes these high oil prices, so they're not eager for this to be resolved. China's actually different. I think China is actually at this point eager for both the U.S. blockade and the disruptions in the Strait of Hormuz by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy to dissipate and move on. And so fundamentally, the other issue I'll mention is, last point, is what we've also seen is the rise of drone warfare. This really started in the Black Sea, where the Ukrainians, who don't have a navy, essentially defeated the Russian Black Sea Navy and even sunk its flagship, the Moskva. And then we saw the Houthis take similar technology, drones, and then also they were the first non-state armed group to launch an anti-ship ballistic missile. And they did that after October 7th, disrupting commercial shipping through the Bab el-Mandeb and the Red Sea. And that commercial shipping is never actually fully returned. And then we see the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, around the Strait of Hormuz use small boats, fiber optic drones that can't be jammed, and then, of course, anti-ship missiles. And so fundamentally, in sum, what we're seeing here is the international maritime law regime is under pressure from new technology, where geography, like the Strait of Hormuz, can be used for what's called asymmetric warfare. So using relatively cheap technologies like drones to disrupt commercial shipping and put navies push the navies back into deeper waters. The navies can go through, but they risk casualties or damage to their ships. So happy to discuss any of that.
So let me bring in George on some of those points. Is this not just the maritime dimension of what we're seeing elsewhere, which is everyone has stopped abiding by the rules that were there since World War II? And what is that going to mean for international shipping if we go back to much more ancient times, yet with much more sophisticated weaponry?
Well, this is really a crucial question. This is really the core of the matter. I'd like to echo what was said earlier by both of my colleagues. And what I said earlier about the global system of maritime governance or ocean governance against the backdrop that we had, which was really the international law, customary law, but also the UN Charter post-Second World War. It seems that at the moment, the model, which was structured again at that time, with the 5 members of the Security Council and the unanimity which is required, this is, again, under pressure. And it seems that unless the rules of the game, if I could use that expression, to a certain extent, either are respected or somehow we find an amendment coming forward, we will have the same problems. We saw that where, as it was said earlier, in 2009, there was absolute unanimity. All the international community was on that particular matter on the same ground. At the moment, we see that whenever, and also in other areas, whenever there is an attempt really to pass a resolution, one of the members of the Security Council is blocking it, which of course tests again the limits of our system. The system, which, as I said earlier, is the one that ensures that we have the supply chain in place. We have freedom of navigation.
Let me bring in Stavros at the end. And just, I mean, there is a risk of widening war around the world. But if we're just talking about disruption, who is paying the price of this? I assume it's all of us.
That's absolutely right. It's everybody. And we have to consider that shipping, for example, is responsible for carrying several billion tons of cargo. Just to remind you, for example, that the value of a vessel, as we were talking a minute ago about piracy, a value of a vessel approximately is 150 million for one vessel. And you have to consider that some of them, they have a couple of billions on top of that in terms of value of cargo. So it makes sense that, first of all, the pirates want to get hold of them. And also, whatever is happening in the region, everybody wants to use shipping as a bargaining chip because there is a lot of power in terms of economics on it. You know, it costs a lot of money to move stuff around the globe, and everything has been loaded on vessels.
Stavros Karamperidis, George Theokaridis, and Rockford Weiss, thank you for joining us on today's Inside Story. If you missed any of this fascinating discussion, don't worry, you can watch the programme again anytime you want at aljazeera.com. What did you think of this topic? You can post on our Facebook page, facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or join the conversation on X. There you'll find us at AJ Inside Story. For now, that's it from me, James Bays, and the team here. But of course, it's not it from Al Jazeera. Coverage continues around the clock. Stand by for an update in just a moment.